Christmas was always supposed to feel warm, not because of the lights or the gifts or the music playing softly in the background, but because it was the one day every year when family gathered and pretended everything was okay. At least that is what I believed for most of my life. I never imagined that one Christmas night would become the moment my understanding of family changed forever. I never imagined I would walk into a house filled with people I loved and walk out feeling completely invisible. And I never imagined that silence could hurt more than shouting ever could. My name does not matter as much as the story does, because this story is not just mine. It belongs to anyone who has ever felt unwanted in a room full of relatives. It belongs to anyone who has ever smiled through pain because they did not want to ruin the holiday. It belongs to anyone who has ever asked themselves whether love was supposed to feel like this, that Christmas started like every other one before it. I woke up early even though I had not slept well. I remember lying in bed staring at the ceiling, feeling a strange heaviness in my chest. I told myself it was just nerves. Family gatherings always made me anxious, but I convinced myself it would be fine. It was Christmas after all. I got dressed carefully, not too formal, not too casual. I wanted to look like I belonged. I remember standing in front of the mirror longer than usual, adjusting my sweater and smoothing down wrinkles that were barely there. I wanted to look acceptable. I wanted to look worthy of being there. As I drove to my parents' house, the streets were quiet. Christmas morning had that strange calm to it. Lights were still glowing in windows. A few people walked their dogs bundled in coats. Everything looked peaceful from the outside. I parked the car and sat there for a moment before going inside. I took a deep breath and reminded myself that I was family, that I had every right to be there, that I was not asking for too much by wanting to feel included. When I opened the door, I was greeted by noise, laughter, the sound of plates clinking, voices overlapping. The smell of food filled the air, and for a brief moment I felt relief. It felt normal. It felt like Christmas. People were already seated around the table. Some glanced in my direction, some did not. A few smiles appeared briefly and then disappeared just as quickly. I said hello and tried to sound cheerful. My voice felt smaller than usual, as if it struggled to carry across the room. No one asked how my drive was. No one asked how I had been. Those questions used to be exchanged without thinking. Now they seemed to have vanished. I stood there unsure of where to sit. The table was almost full. Plates were already placed. Conversations continued without pause. It was as if my arrival did not change the atmosphere at all. I eventually found an empty chair at the far end of the table, not intentionally left for me, just unoccupied. I pulled it out and sat down quietly. As dinner went on, I listened more than I spoke. Stories were shared, jokes were told, plans were discussed. Inside, jokes flew across the table that I did not understand anymore. I laughed at the right moments even when I felt lost. I nodded when it seemed appropriate. No one spoke directly to me, not once, not a question, not a comment, not even a passing glance that lingered long enough to feel real. At first, I told myself I was imagining it, that I was being sensitive, that everyone was just caught up in the holiday excitement. I tried to ignore the tightening feeling in my chest. I tried to push down the thought that I was being quietly excluded. Then the plates were passed around. Everyone received a full serving. The dish reached me last. What remained was barely enough for half a plate. No one noticed, or worse, they noticed and chose not to care. I stared at the food in front of me, and suddenly my appetite disappeared. My throat tightened. I felt embarrassed for feeling hurt by something so small, and yet it did not feel small at all. I realized then that this was not about food. It was about being an afterthought. It was about realizing that my presence did not matter the way it once did. I looked around the table and saw people I had shared years of memories with, birthdays, graduations, losses, holidays, moments that were supposed to mean something. And yet in that moment, I felt like a stranger who had wandered into the wrong house. No one asked if I was okay. No one noticed that I had gone quiet. No one noticed that I had barely touched my food. I remember staring at my hands resting on my lap and feeling an overwhelming sense of shame. Shame for feeling unwanted. Shame for hoping for more. Shame for still caring. As dessert was served, conversations grew louder. People leaned closer to each other. Laughter filled the room again. I sat there feeling smaller with every passing minute. At one point, someone stood up and announced plans for later that evening. Plans that included everyone at the table, everyone except me. They did not say my name. They did not look in my direction. They spoke as if I was not there. That was the moment something inside me broke. I realized I could sit there and disappear quietly, or I could leave and preserve what little dignity I had left. I chose to leave. I pushed my chair back gently so it would not make noise. No one noticed. I stood up. Still no one noticed. I walked toward the door feeling numb. I paused for a moment hoping someone would call my name, hoping someone would ask where I was going, hoping someone would notice my absence. No one did. I put on my coat slowly. My hands were shaking. My heart felt heavy. I opened the door and stepped outside into the cold air. The silence outside felt louder than the noise inside. I stood there for a moment, letting the cold sting my face as tears filled my eyes. I refused to cry inside that house. I refused to give them that. As I drove away, the lights on the houses blurred through my tears. Christmas music played faintly on the radio, but I turned it off. The silence felt more honest. I kept asking myself what I had done wrong. When did I become so easy to ignore? When did I stop mattering? That night, I sat alone in my apartment with the lights off. No tree, no music, no celebration. Just me and the weight of everything I had been holding in for years. That Christmas dinner was not the first time I had felt excluded, but it was the first time I could no longer deny it. It was the moment I stopped making excuses for people who kept hurting me quietly. I did not know it then, but that night marked the beginning of something new. Not healing yet, just awareness, painful awareness, because before healing can begin, you have to see the wound clearly. And that Christmas dinner showed me just how deep mine was. The days after Christmas felt heavier than the night itself. The world moved on as if nothing had happened. Stores reopened. People returned gifts. Life continued at a normal pace. But inside me, something had shifted, and I could not put it back where it belonged. I woke up the morning after Christmas with the same ache in my chest. For a brief moment, I hoped the night before had been a bad dream. But then I remembered the table, the laughter, the way no one noticed when I left. And the truth settled in again. I spent that day avoiding my phone. I kept it face down on the table, as if it might burn me if I touched it. A part of me expected a message, a missed call, anything that said someone had noticed my absence. But nothing came, no apology, no explanation, not even a casual message asking if I got home safely. At first, I told myself they were busy. It was the holidays. People get distracted. I made excuse after excuse because accepting the truth felt unbearable. The truth was that my absence had not caused a ripple in their world. That realization hurt more than being left at the table. I replayed the dinner in my mind over and over again. Every glance that never came. Every conversation that moved past me. Every moment where I could have spoken up but didn't. I wondered if I should have said something. If I should have asked why I was being ignored. If leaving silently was a mistake. But deep down, I knew that speaking up would not have changed anything. You cannot force people to care. You cannot argue your way into being valued. I had spent years believing that love meant endurance. That if I stayed long enough, tried hard enough, forgave enough, things would eventually get better. That one day, they would see me the way I wanted to be seen. Christmas proved that belief wrong. The silence that followed was loud. It filled every corner of my apartment. I tried distracting myself with television, with cleaning, with work. But the quiet always returned. And in that quiet, thoughts I had been avoiding for years finally surfaced. I began to realize that this was not an isolated incident. This was a pattern. I thought about birthdays where my presence felt optional, family gatherings where conversations stopped when I entered the room, moments where my feelings were dismissed as overreactions, times I was told to be grateful instead of honest. I had been minimizing my pain because acknowledging it felt like betrayal. betrayal of the idea of family, betrayal of the hope that things would change. Growing up, I learned early that keeping the peace was more important than telling the truth. I learned to stay quiet when something hurt. I learned to smile even when I felt invisible. I learned to believe that love meant adapting to whatever space people allowed me. But love is not supposed to feel like erasure. As the days passed, anger began to replace sadness, not explosive anger. Not the kind that screams, but a slow, burning anger that sits heavy in your chest. I was angry at them for ignoring me, but I was also angry at myself, angry for staying silent, angry for hoping, angry for showing up again and again to places where I felt unseen. I realized that part of why the Christmas dinner hurt so much was because it confirmed a fear I had been carrying for years, the fear that I mattered less, that my presence was tolerated, not valued, that I was included out of obligation, not love. Acknowledging that fear felt like losing something permanent, because once you see the truth, you cannot unsee it. I considered reaching out, typing a message, asking why no one noticed when I left, asking if I had done something wrong, but every draft sounded like an apology for existing. I deleted every message I wrote. I began to understand that chasing answers from people who refused to acknowledge my pain would only deepen the wound. I did not need explanations that would likely minimize my feelings. I did not need excuses disguised as justifications. What I needed was space. That realization scared me. Family had always been my anchor, even when it hurt. Letting go of that attachment felt like stepping into open water without knowing how to swim. I was terrified of what it meant to distance myself, terrified of being alone, terrified of confirming the belief that I was disposable. But staying was hurting me more than leaving ever could. As New Year's approached, people around me talked about resolutions, fresh starts, new beginnings. I listened quietly, unsure of what mine would be. I did not want revenge. I did not want confrontation. I did not want to punish anyone. I wanted peace. And for the first time, I started to consider the idea that peace might require walking away, not dramatically, not with ultimatums, but with quiet boundaries. That thought brought guilt with it, guilt that whispered I was being selfish, that I was abandoning my family, that I was overreacting to one bad night. But it wasn't one bad night. It was years of small wounds that never healed because I kept reopening them. One evening, a few days after Christmas, I sat alone with a cup of coffee and allowed myself to feel everything I had been suppressing. The sadness, the anger, the grief, the disappointment. I cried not just for the dinner, but for the version of myself who kept hoping for a different outcome, for the version of myself who believed love had to hurt to be real. That night, I made a quiet promise to myself. I promised that I would stop forcing myself into spaces where I felt unwanted. I promised that I would start listening to the discomfort instead of silencing it. I promised that I would protect my heart the way I had always wished someone else would. I did not know how to heal yet. I did not know what boundaries would look like. I did not know how this would affect my relationships. All I knew was that something had to change. Christmas had exposed a truth I could no longer ignore, and while the truth hurt, it also offered clarity. The silence after that dinner was not empty. It was revealing. It showed me what had been missing all along, and slowly, without realizing it, that silence began to teach me how to listen to myself. For a long time after that Christmas, I believed the pain was my fault. Not consciously at first. It lived quietly in the background of my thoughts, shaping the way I spoke to myself, the way I remembered things, the way I explained the situation when my mind replayed it late at night. I told myself I should have tried harder. I should have spoken louder. I should have been more interesting, more agreeable, more patient. I told myself that if I had been easier to love, none of this would have happened. Self-blame is a strange thing. It disguises itself as responsibility. It convinces you that if you caused the pain, then you also have the power to prevent it from happening again. It feels safer than admitting that sometimes people choose not to care, no matter how much effort you give. I carried that belief quietly as the new year began. I went back to work. I smiled at coworkers. I answered emails, From the outside, everything looked normal, but inside, I was constantly questioning my worth. I noticed how often I apologized for things that were not my fault, for taking up space, for having an opinion, for needing rest, for feeling hurt. That Christmas dinner had not just wounded me in the moment. It had reopened old patterns I had learned long before I could name them. Growing up, I was the one who adapted, the one who adjusted their tone, the one who learned early that love came with conditions. If I was calm enough, helpful enough, understanding enough, I would be accepted. I learned that conflict meant withdrawal, that expressing pain meant being labeled difficult, that silence kept relationships intact. So I became quiet, I became agreeable, I became someone who tried to earn their place in the room. That Christmas, I did what I had always done. I stayed quiet, I made myself small, I waited for someone else to notice. And when no one did, the old belief returned stronger than ever, that I was invisible because I deserved to be. It took time for me to see how unfair that belief was. One evening, weeks after Christmas, I was sitting alone scrolling through old photos on my phone. Pictures from past holidays, smiling faces, group shots where I stood slightly to the side, always present, rarely centered. I realized something then that stopped me cold. I had always been there, I had always shown up. I had always tried. The problem was not that I was absent. The problem was that my presence had been taken for granted. That realization did not come with relief right away. It came with grief. Grief for the years I spent blaming myself for other people's emotional distance. Grief for the energy I poured into relationships that asked for my sacrifice, but offered no safety in return. Grief for the version of myself who believed love was something to be earned. I began paying attention to how my body reacted when I thought about my family. The tightness in my chest, the shallow breaths, the heaviness in my stomach. My body had been trying to tell me the truth long before my mind was ready to hear it. I started journaling, not because I knew what I was doing, but because the thoughts in my head needed somewhere to go. At first, the pages were filled with questions. Why wasn't I enough? Why didn't they notice? What did I do wrong? Then slowly the questions changed. Why did I accept being ignored? Why did I stay silent when it hurt? Why did I believe my feelings mattered less? Those questions were harder to answer because they required me to look at myself with honesty instead of criticism. I realized that blaming myself had been a way to stay connected. If the problem was me, then the solution was also me. I could fix it. I could change. I could try again. But if the problem was that my needs were never prioritized, then the truth was much harder to accept. It meant that some people were comfortable with my pain as long as it kept them comfortable. That realization hurt deeply, but it also shifted something inside me. I started noticing patterns in other relationships too. How often I was the one checking in first, how often I adjusted my schedule, how often I excused behavior that made me feel small. I began to see that Christmas dinner was not an exception, it was a reflection. Once I saw that, I could no longer pretend the hurt came out of nowhere. It had been building quietly for years. I stopped asking myself why they didn't notice me leaving, and I started asking why I had stayed in places where my leaving didn't matter. That question did not come with judgment. It came with compassion. I understood then that I stayed because I was afraid. Afraid of being alone, afraid of conflict, afraid of confirming the belief that I was not worth fighting for. But staying had not protected me, it had only taught me to abandon myself. I began reading about emotional neglect, about families where needs go unspoken, about people who grow up believing love must be earned through endurance. Every word felt uncomfortably familiar. I learned that healing does not start with confrontation. It starts with recognition, with naming what hurt without minimizing it. For the first time, I allowed myself to say it out loud. Even if no one else heard me, I was hurt, I was excluded, I deserved better. Those words felt strange in my mouth at first, almost rebellious, but they also felt true. I realized that healing did not mean proving my worth to anyone. It meant believing in it myself. That belief did not come all at once. It came in small moments, choosing not to explain myself when I didn't want to, saying no without providing a justification, letting silence exist without rushing to fill it. Each small choice felt uncomfortable, but it also felt empowering. I stopped checking my phone for messages that never came. I stopped replaying the dinner in my mind, not because it stopped hurting, but because I no longer needed it to define me. I began to understand that being left at that table did not mean I was unlovable. It meant I had been in a space that could not meet me where I was. That distinction mattered. For years, I believed pain was something to tolerate. Now I was learning it was something to listen to. I wasn't healed yet, not even close, but I had stopped blaming myself for other people's inability to show up. And that was the first real step forward. Because when you stop blaming yourself, you create space for something new, for boundaries, for self-respect, for a version of love that does not require disappearance. That Christmas had taken something from me. But it had also given me clarity, and clarity, I would soon learn, is where healing truly begins. After I stopped blaming myself, the next realization arrived quietly. Healing was not going to come from understanding alone. It was going to require change, and change, I learned, often begins with distance. That idea terrified me. Distance felt like punishment, like abandonment, like doing to them what they had done to me. I had spent most of my life believing that love meant staying, no matter how uncomfortable it became. Walking away felt wrong, even when staying hurt. I wrestled with that conflict for weeks. Some days I convinced myself I was overreacting. Other days I felt certain that if I returned too soon, nothing would be different. What scared me most was not losing them. It was losing the version of myself that believed things could still change. Distance forced me to face a painful truth. Some relationships survive only because one person keeps sacrificing themselves. And once that sacrifice stops, the relationship reveals its true shape. I did not announce my decision. I did not send messages explaining my absence. I simply stopped initiating contact. At first, it felt unnatural. My hands would reach for my phone without thinking. I wanted to check in, to send a casual message, to prove I was still there. Each time I stopped myself, guilt washed over me. I heard the familiar voice telling me I was being cold, that I was selfish, that I was breaking the family apart. But another voice had started speaking too. A quieter one. It reminded me how it felt to sit at that table unnoticed, how it felt to walk out without anyone asking me to stay. That voice asked me a simple question. Why is protecting your heart considered selfish when hurting it is expected? I had no answer. As days turned into weeks, something unexpected happened. No one reached out. At first I waited. I told myself they were busy, that they would notice eventually, that my absence would finally mean something. But the silence stretched on, and with that silence came clarity. My distance had not disrupted their lives. It had only given me room to breathe. I noticed how much lighter my days felt without constant anxiety. Without replaying conversations, without anticipating disappointment, I slept better, I laughed more easily, I stopped bracing myself emotionally. That realization brought relief and sadness at the same time. Relief because I was no longer hurting, sadness because it confirmed what I had been avoiding, that I was not as essential to their lives as I had believed. Distance showed me something I could not see while I was still trying to belong. It showed me that love cannot be sustained on effort alone. I began redefining what boundaries meant. They were not walls built out of anger. They were lines drawn out of self-respect. I did not hate my family. I did not wish them harm. I simply stopped placing myself in positions where I felt invisible. That distinction mattered. I learned that boundaries do not require permission. You do not need someone else to understand your pain in order to protect yourself from it. Still, there were moments when doubt crept in. Moments when I wondered if I was being dramatic. Moments when I questioned whether I should reach out just to keep the peace. But peace at the cost of myself was no longer peace. It was self-erasure. I spent a lot of time alone during that period. Not lonely, just alone. There is a difference. Loneliness feels like absence. Aloneness feels like presence. For the first time in a long time, I was present with myself. I began noticing how much of my identity had been shaped around keeping others comfortable, how often I measured my worth by my usefulness, how rarely I asked myself what I needed. Distance gave me the space to ask those questions honestly. What did I want from relationships? What made me feel safe? What kind of connection felt nourishing instead of draining? Those questions did not have immediate answers, but asking them felt like progress. I realized that choosing myself did not mean rejecting my family. It meant refusing to reject myself any longer. There were moments when memories resurfaced, good ones, shared laughter, times when things felt easier. Those memories brought a wave of grief. Grief for what once was. Grief for what I hoped could be again. I allowed myself to feel that grief without letting it pull me backward. Missing someone does not mean returning to the same patterns that hurt you. That was a hard lesson to learn. Distance did not make the pain disappear completely, but it softened its edges. It made the hurt manageable. I stopped expecting apologies that never came. I stopped waiting for recognition that was never offered. Instead, I focused on what I could control: my time, my energy, my presence. For the first time, I began building a life that did not revolve around being accepted by people who could not meet me emotionally. That choice was not loud, it was quiet, almost invisible to anyone else, but inside me it marked a turning point. I was no longer trying to prove my worth, I was honoring it, and while distance once felt like abandonment, it slowly revealed itself as something else entirely. Protection. There is a kind of grief no one prepares you for. It does not come with casseroles or sympathy cards. It does not have a clear beginning or a clean ending. It is the grief of realizing that the family you have is not the family you believed in. Once I created distance, I expected relief to be permanent, and in many ways life did feel calmer. But beneath that calm, grief began to surface, not the dramatic kind, the quiet kind that sneaks up on you when you least expect it. It came when I passed families laughing together in grocery store aisles, when coworkers talked about holiday plans, when commercials showed long tables filled with warmth and belonging. Those moments reminded me of something I had lost. Or maybe something I never truly had. I was not grieving the Christmas dinner itself anymore. I was grieving the illusion that had kept me going for so long. The belief that if I just tried harder, loved deeper, stayed quieter, things would eventually feel right. Letting go of that belief felt like losing a part of myself. There were days when loneliness settled in heavily, evenings when the silence felt too large for the room, moments when I questioned whether choosing distance had been a mistake. I missed the idea of family more than the reality of it. That distinction was painful to accept. I realized how much of my identity had been wrapped around belonging to something that no longer fit. Family had been my reference point for everything. My history, my sense of place, my understanding of who I was. Without that anchor, I felt untethered. There were nights when I cried not because I wanted to go back, but because I knew I could not. Because even if I returned, I would never see things the same way again. Grief does not always ask for action. Sometimes it only asks to be felt. So I stopped trying to distract myself from it. I let the sadness sit with me. I let the questions remain unanswered. Why did it have to be this way? Why couldn't they see me? Why wasn't love enough? Those questions did not need solutions. They needed acknowledgement. I began to understand that grieving did not mean I was weak. It meant I was honest. I was grieving the loss of potential, the family gatherings I hoped would feel different, the conversations I wished we could have had, the closeness I imagined was just around the corner. That kind of loss cuts deeply because it is invisible. Others might say nothing really changed, but everything had changed for me. I learned that grief is not linear. Some days felt light and hopeful. Other days felt heavy and isolating. On the heavy days, I reminded myself why I chose distance. I reminded myself how it felt to be unseen. I reminded myself that missing something does not mean it was healthy. Slowly, I started to redefine what family meant to me. It was no longer about shared blood or shared history. It was about shared care, consistency, emotional safety, That realization opened a door I did not know existed. I began noticing the people who showed up quietly in my life, friends who checked in without being asked, colleagues who listened without judgment, strangers who offered kindness without conditions. I realized that family could be built, not inherited. This idea felt both comforting and sad. Comforting because it meant I was not alone. Sad because it meant letting go of the belief that family was guaranteed. I stopped forcing myself to fit into roles that drained me, the peacemaker, the understanding one, the one who never complained. I allowed myself to be human, to need support, to ask for help. There was power in admitting that I could not carry everything on my own anymore. Grief softened over time, not because the loss disappeared, but because I learned how to hold it. I learned that healing does not mean forgetting. It means integrating the experience into who you are without letting it define you. I could remember Christmas without reliving the pain. I could think of my family without feeling crushed by disappointment. That felt like progress. I stopped romanticizing the past. I stopped editing memories to make them easier to carry. I allowed myself to see things as they were, and in doing so, I stopped blaming myself for wanting more. Grief taught me something important. You can love people deeply and still accept that they cannot love you in the way you need. That truth is heartbreaking, but it is also freeing. As I grieved, space opened up inside me. Space where resentment once lived, space where longing once consumed me. In that space, something new began to grow. Hope, not hope that things would return to how they were, but hope that something better could exist beyond what I had known. I did not rush that hope. I let it form slowly, gently, because after losing the family I thought I had, I needed to learn how to trust again, and that would be its own journey. After the grief settled into something quieter, I noticed another challenge rising to the surface. I did not know how to be kind to myself. For most of my life, I had measured my worth by how much I could endure, how much I could give, how little I needed in return. Letting go of my family's expectations did not automatically teach me how to care for myself. In many ways, I was still carrying their voices inside me, telling me to be stronger, telling me not to dwell, telling me to move on without acknowledging what had been lost. Healing required something different. It required softness, and softness felt unfamiliar. I realized how harsh my inner dialogue had been, how often I dismissed my own pain the same way it had been dismissed at that table, how quickly I told myself I should be over it by now. But wounds do not follow schedules, and healing is not a performance. I began practicing something that felt uncomfortable at first. I began speaking to myself the way I wished someone else had spoken to me that night. I allowed myself to say that it hurt, without adding that it could have been worse, without comparing my pain to anyone else's. I learned that self-compassion is not self-pity. It is self-respect. Some days, being gentle meant resting without guilt. It meant canceling plans when my energy felt low. It meant choosing quiet evenings over forcing myself to be productive. Other days, it meant doing hard things, sitting with uncomfortable emotions, acknowledging anger without turning it inward. Letting sadness exist without trying to solve it. I noticed how my body responded when I slowed down. My shoulders relaxed, my breathing deepened. The constant tension I had lived with for years began to ease. I started paying attention to what made me feel grounded. Simple routines, morning walks, journaling without censoring myself, music that matched my mood instead of trying to change it. These small acts of care felt insignificant at first, but over time they became anchors, reminders that I was allowed to take up space in my own life. I also began examining the beliefs I had carried for so long. The belief that asking for help was weakness. The belief that love had to be earned. The belief that my needs were burdens. Those beliefs did not disappear overnight. They surfaced again and again. But now, when they did, I questioned them. Who taught me this? Who benefits from me believing this? Is this belief helping me heal or keeping me stuck? Often, the answers were uncomfortable. I realized that I had learned to survive in my family by shrinking myself. By being easy, by being low maintenance. That survival strategy had kept me connected, but it had also cost me my voice, Part of healing meant reclaiming that voice, even if it trembled, even if it felt uncertain. I began setting small boundaries with myself, not pushing through exhaustion, not minimizing my feelings, not forcing forgiveness before I was ready. Forgiveness, I learned, is not a requirement for healing. Understanding is not the same as excusing, and letting go does not always mean reconciling. These realizations brought a strange sense of relief. I stopped measuring my progress by how little I felt, and started measuring it by how honestly I could feel. There were moments when memories from that Christmas still surfaced unexpectedly, a holiday song, a familiar scent, a mention of family traditions. When that happened, I no longer scolded myself for reacting. I allowed the emotion to pass through me like a wave. I reminded myself that healing is not about erasing the past. It is about learning how to carry it without letting it crush you. I began to trust myself more, not because I had all the answers, but because I knew I would listen to myself when something felt wrong. That trust was new and fragile, but it was real. I also started noticing how different it felt to receive kindness. When someone offered support without conditions, when someone listened without trying to fix me, when someone stayed present without asking me to be anything other than myself. At first, I resisted it. I felt uncomfortable, suspicious even, but slowly I let myself accept it. I realized how much I had been bracing for disappointment, how often I expected to be overlooked. Learning to receive love required unlearning that expectation. That process was slow and uneven, but it was transformative. For the first time, I was not trying to earn my place. I was allowing myself to exist as I was. The version of me who walked out of that Christmas dinner had felt small and broken. The version of me now was learning something powerful, that my worth did not disappear when others failed to see it, that being left did not mean I was unlovable, that healing begins the moment you stop abandoning yourself. I was not healed yet, but I was kinder to myself than I had ever been before, and that kindness became the foundation for everything that came next. There came a moment when I realized healing was no longer just about what I had lost. It was about what I was willing to build. For a long time, my focus had been on absence, who was not there, who did not reach out, who failed to notice when I left that Christmas dinner. But slowly, almost without me realizing it, my attention began to shift. I started noticing presence instead, not the loud kind, not the dramatic gestures that demand recognition, but the quiet, steady kind that stays. It surprised me how unfamiliar that felt. I had grown so used to relationships that required effort, explanation, and endurance that ease felt suspicious. When someone showed up without me asking, my first instinct was to wonder what they wanted in return. When someone listened without interrupting, I waited for the moment they would grow tired of me. Healing revealed just how deeply my expectations had been shaped by emotional neglect. I was learning a new language, the language of mutual care. At first, it felt awkward. I did not know how much of myself to share. I did not know when it was safe to relax. I did not know how to accept connection without bracing for disappointment. But I kept going. I started with small choices, choosing people who made me feel calm instead of anxious, choosing conversations where I did not feel rushed or minimized, choosing honesty over performance. I noticed how my body reacted around certain people. Some interactions left me drained, tight, restless. Others left me lighter, grounded, more myself. I began trusting those signals. For most of my life, I had ignored them. I had been taught that discomfort was normal, that love required effort, that relationships were supposed to be hard. But there is a difference between effort and exhaustion, and I was finally learning to tell them apart. As I formed new connections, I became aware of how much I had been editing myself in the past, softening opinions, swallowing feelings, avoiding topics that might make others uncomfortable. I stopped doing that. Not abruptly, not aggressively, but intentionally. I spoke when something mattered to me. I paused when something did not feel right. I allowed silence without rushing to fill it. Some people drifted away as a result. And for the first time, I did not chase them. That was not rejection. That was alignment. Others leaned in closer. They listened. They stayed curious. They respected my boundaries without questioning them. Those were the connections that began to redefine my understanding of belonging. I realized that belonging is not about being included at a table. It is about being seen when you are there. It is about not having to disappear to be accepted. That truth felt revolutionary. I thought about that Christmas dinner often during this phase of my healing. Not with the same ache, but with clarity. I saw myself sitting there quietly, hoping someone would notice. And I felt compassion instead of shame. I did not know then what I know now. I did not know that belonging cannot be forced. I did not know that being related does not guarantee connection. I forgave that version of myself for staying too long, for hoping too hard, for believing that love would eventually meet me if I waited. Belonging, I learned, is not something you wait for. It is something you choose. I chose it by choosing myself. That choice changed the way I approached every relationship. I stopped asking how I could fit in and started asking how I felt. Did I feel respected? Did I feel safe? Did I feel valued? If the answer was no, I no longer tried to negotiate my worth. This shift did not make life perfect. It did not erase loneliness entirely, but it made my loneliness honest. I would rather feel alone than feel invisible. That realization was powerful. I began creating traditions that belonged to me. Holidays spent with friends. Quiet evenings that felt nourishing instead of empty. Moments of joy that were not tied to obligation. I reclaimed Christmas slowly, not the version I grew up with, but a version that felt gentle and intentional. I learned that family can be chosen, and that chosen family often knows how to show up in ways blood relatives never learned. This did not mean I stopped caring about my family of origin. It meant I stopped expecting them to become something they were not. Acceptance does not always come with reconciliation. Sometimes it comes with release. I released the hope that one day they would understand without me explaining. I released the fantasy that love would suddenly become effortless. In that release, I found peace. I also found strength. I no longer feared being left, because I knew how to stay with myself. That confidence changed the energy I brought into relationships. I was no longer seeking validation. I was offering connection, and the difference was noticeable. People responded to authenticity in ways they never responded to accommodation. I began to feel rooted in myself, less reactive, more grounded. When misunderstandings arose, I addressed them calmly. When boundaries were crossed, I spoke up. When someone could not meet me where I was, I let go without self-blame. These were skills I had never been taught. I had to learn them slowly, patiently, sometimes painfully, but each step brought me closer to a sense of belonging that did not depend on anyone else's approval. Belonging became internal. It lived in my ability to honor my feelings, to trust my instincts, to choose relationships that felt reciprocal. I no longer measured my worth by how many seats I was offered at a table. I measured it by how freely I could be myself. The memory of that Christmas dinner no longer defined me. It informed me, it reminded me of what I will never accept again, and what I deserve instead. Healing did not bring me back to where I started. It brought me somewhere new, a place where belonging is not begged for, a place where connection is mutual, a place where I am not left behind because I no longer leave myself. And in that place, I finally understood something I had been searching for my entire life. Home is not where you are tolerated. Home is where you are known. For a long time, the word forgiveness made me uncomfortable. It felt loaded, heavy, dangerous even. Growing up, forgiveness was presented to me as an obligation, something you offered quickly so things could return to normal. Something that erased conflict and allowed everyone to move on without addressing what caused the pain in the first place. Forgiveness was never about healing. It was about silence. So when people suggested forgiveness after that Christmas, I resisted it instinctively. They meant well. They always do. They said things like family is family. They said holding on to anger would only hurt me. They said forgiveness would bring peace. But what they did not understand was that I was not angry in the way they imagined. I was wounded, and forgiving too soon felt like reopening the door to being hurt again. I believed forgiveness meant pretending it never happened, pretending the table had not been full without me, pretending I had not walked out alone, pretending it did not change something fundamental inside me. I was not ready for that kind of forgiveness, and I did not owe it to anyone. It took time for me to realize that forgiveness did not have to look like reconciliation. It did not have to involve conversations, apologies, or renewed closeness. It did not require anyone else's participation. Forgiveness, I learned, could be private, it could be quiet, it could be slow, and most importantly, it could be for me. At first, I thought I needed answers in order to forgive. I wanted explanations, I wanted acknowledgement, I wanted someone to say they noticed, that they cared, that they understood the impact of their actions. But as time passed, it became clear that those answers might never come, and waiting for them kept me emotionally tied to a moment that no longer deserved that much power. Forgiveness began not as a decision, but as a realization. I realized how much energy I was spending replaying the past, how often my mind returned to that table, how frequently I imagined different outcomes. I was no longer living in the pain, but I was still carrying it, and carrying it was exhausting. I noticed how resentment lingered quietly beneath the surface, not explosive, not consuming, but persistent. It showed up when holidays approached, when family was mentioned casually in conversation, when I saw photos of gatherings I was not part of. Resentment whispered that I had been wronged, and it was right. But it also whispered that staying angry kept me safe, that letting go meant minimizing what happened, that forgiving meant excusing behavior that hurt me deeply. Those beliefs felt protective, but they were also limiting. I began asking myself a different question. What would forgiveness look like if it did not require contact, if it did not require understanding, if it did not require reconciliation? The answer surprised me. Forgiveness, I realized, could mean releasing the expectation that the past should have been different, not approving of it, not justifying it, but accepting that it happened and that I survived it. Forgiveness could mean acknowledging that people acted from their own limitations, their own emotional blind spots, their own inability to show up in ways I needed, that did not make their behavior acceptable. But it made it understandable. Understanding softened the sharp edges of resentment. I stopped asking why they did not notice me leaving. I started accepting that they may never know how much it hurt, and that my healing did not depend on their awareness. This shift was subtle but powerful. I noticed that when I stopped rehearsing the hurt, my mind had more space, space for joy, space for creativity, space for presence. Forgiveness did not erase the memory, but it loosened its grip. I no longer felt the same surge of emotion when I thought about that Christmas dinner. The memory felt distant, like a chapter I had already finished reading. There were moments when anger resurfaced. Healing is not linear. Forgiveness is not permanent. When that happened, I did not shame myself. I reminded myself that forgiveness is a practice, not a single act. Some days, forgiving meant reminding myself that I did not deserve what happened. Other days, it meant allowing myself to feel sadness without assigning blame. I stopped viewing forgiveness as something I owed. I started seeing it as something I chose, and choice made all the difference. Forgiveness gave me back my energy. It freed me from carrying resentment into new relationships. It allowed me to be present without being guarded. I also realized that forgiving did not mean forgetting boundaries. I could forgive and still choose distance. I could forgive and still protect myself. Those two things were not opposites, they were partners. I did not need to reopen old wounds to prove that I had healed. I did not need to reconcile to validate my forgiveness. My peace did not require their participation. This realization felt empowering. I no longer waited for apologies that might never come. I no longer imagined conversations that would change everything. I accepted that closure does not always arrive in the form of resolution. Sometimes closure is acceptance. Acceptance that people did the best they could with the tools they had, even if that best was not enough. Acceptance that I deserved more than what they were able to give, and that both things could be true at the same time. Forgiveness allowed me to see my family clearly, without idealizing them, without villainizing them. They were human, flawed, limited, and so was I. This clarity softened my heart without reopening it to harm. I stopped carrying the story of being left as a defining identity. It became part of my history, not my present. Forgiveness did not make me forget the pain, but it stopped the pain from narrating my life. I felt lighter, more open, less reactive. I noticed how much easier it became to extend grace to myself, to others, to life. Forgiveness did not change the past, but it changed how I carried it. It allowed me to move forward without dragging resentment behind me. Without letting one night define my future, I realized something profound during this phase of healing. Forgiveness is not about them. It never was. It is about reclaiming your emotional freedom. It is about choosing peace over rumination. It is about allowing yourself to grow beyond the hurt. Forgiveness does not mean saying what happened was okay. It means saying I am okay now, and that distinction changed everything. The version of me who walked out of that Christmas dinner believed being left meant something was wrong with me. The version of me now understands that being left revealed something that was missing there. Forgiveness helped me stop searching for myself in places that could not reflect me accurately. It brought me back to myself. And in doing so, it prepared me for the final stage of my healing, not forgetting, not reconciling, but fully stepping into a life that no longer revolved around that loss, a life built on presence, on choice, on peace. And that is where true healing began to settle in. There was no dramatic moment when I realized I had found closure, no sudden relief, no clear lines separating before and after. It happened quietly, almost invisibly, the way healing often does. One day, I noticed I was no longer checking my phone with expectation, not scanning for a message that would change everything, not imagining explanations that would finally make sense of the past. The absence of waiting felt strange at first. Waiting had been part of my identity for so long, waiting for understanding, waiting for acknowledgement, waiting for someone to finally see me. Letting go of that waiting felt like losing something familiar. Even though it had caused me pain, I realized that for years a part of my life had been on pause, emotionally suspended in the hope that one day things would be different, that one conversation would fix what had been broken, that one apology would restore what had been lost. But healing required something radical. It required me to stop living in anticipation of a past that could never be rewritten. Closure, I learned, is not something someone gives you. It is something you allow yourself to take. It is the decision to stop asking questions that have no answers, to stop knocking on doors that remain closed, to stop reopening wounds just to prove they hurt. I began to feel grounded in a way I never had before. Not because everything was resolved, but because I was no longer seeking resolution from the people who hurt me. That was the turning point. I started noticing how much energy had been freed by that decision. Energy that had once gone into rumination, into self-doubt, into replaying moments that could not be changed. With that energy, I began building a life that was not shaped by absence. I pursued interests that had nothing to do with proving anything to anyone. I invested in routines that made me feel stable. I surrounded myself with people who showed up consistently, without being asked. There was a sense of ownership in my life that I had never felt before. For the first time, I was not living in reaction to my family. I was living in response to myself. That shift changed how I carried myself. I spoke with more clarity. I moved with more confidence. I stopped shrinking in spaces that demanded my presence. I realized that emotional abandonment does not end when someone leaves you. It ends when you stop internalizing the message that their leaving defines your worth. That message had lived inside me for years. Quiet, persistent, unquestioned, letting it go felt like removing a weight I did not know I was carrying. I stopped measuring my success by whether anyone noticed. I stopped interpreting silence as judgment. I stopped assuming that being left meant I was lacking. These changes did not make me invincible. They made me honest. There were still moments of sadness, moments when memories surfaced unexpectedly, moments when grief reminded me of what I never had. But those moments no longer consumed me. They passed through me without taking residence. I had learned how to hold pain without letting it define my future. One of the most powerful realizations during this time was understanding that my life did not need to make sense to anyone else. I did not need to justify my boundaries. I did not need to explain why distance was necessary. I did not need validation to move forward. That realization was deeply freeing. I stopped rehearsing explanations in my head, stopped imagining confrontations, stopped preparing defenses. I trusted that my choices were enough. I also learned something important about strength. Strength is not loud. It does not announce itself. It does not seek recognition. Strength is choosing yourself quietly, consistently, even when no one is watching. I saw how much I had grown since that Christmas dinner. The person who walked out that night felt powerless, disconnected, unworthy. The person I had become was grounded, self-aware, rooted in self-respect. That transformation did not erase the pain, but it gave it meaning. I realized that being left had forced me to find myself, not the version of me shaped by expectation, but the version shaped by truth. I no longer feared abandonment in the same way, because I knew how to stay with myself. That knowledge changed everything. I became more selective with my time, more intentional with my energy, more honest about my needs. When relationships ended, I grieved without self-blame. When connections deepened, I allowed myself to trust without fear. I understood that closure is not about closing your heart. It is about closing the chapter that no longer serves you. That chapter had taught me enough. I no longer needed to reread it. As holidays came and went, I noticed how different they felt. Not empty, not painful, just different. I created rituals that felt authentic. Moments that honored who I was now, not who I used to be. I did not try to replace what I lost. I allowed myself to create something new. There was power in that choice. I no longer viewed my story as one of rejection. I saw it as a story of awakening. Being left did not break me. It revealed what I needed to heal. It taught me the difference between presence and obligation, between love and tolerance, between belonging and endurance. I stopped asking why I was not chosen, and started choosing myself without hesitation. That choice reshaped my life. I felt aligned with myself in a way that made external validation unnecessary. I trusted my instincts. I honored my boundaries. I respected my emotional limits. And most importantly, I stopped living as if something was missing. Nothing was missing anymore. I was whole, not because everything worked out, but because I learned how to live fully even when it didn't. That Christmas dinner no longer haunted me. It no longer defined my worth. It no longer shaped my future. It became a marker, the moment my life turned inward. The moment I stopped waiting for permission to exist fully. Closure did not arrive as forgiveness or reconciliation. It arrived as self-empowerment, as the quiet confidence of knowing who I am, what I deserve, and what I will never accept again. And with that clarity, I stepped into the final phase of my healing, not as someone who was left, but as someone who chose to move forward. I used to believe that being left meant something was wrong with me. That if people walked away or failed to notice my absence, it was proof that I was forgettable, replaceable, easy to overlook. That belief followed me long after that Christmas dinner ended. It sat quietly in the background of my thoughts, influencing how I showed up, how much space I took, how much I allowed myself to need. I did not realize it at the time, but being left did not just hurt me emotionally. It shaped how I lived. I learned to make myself smaller, to need less, to expect disappointment before it arrived. I confused self-protection with self-erasure, but healing has a way of slowly revealing the truth, not all at once, not dramatically, but gently over time. And the truth I came to understand was this: I was not left because I was unlovable. I was left because I had outgrown a space that could no longer hold me. That realization did not come easily. It took years of reflection, of unlearning, of sitting with discomfort instead of running from it. It required me to look honestly at the dynamics I had normalized, the ways I had accepted emotional absence as love, the ways I had mistaken endurance for belonging. I began to see that the table I walked away from was not built for connection. It was built on habit, on expectation, on roles that never changed. There was no room for my truth there, no space for my vulnerability, no recognition of my inner life, and I had mistaken that lack for my own inadequacy. Healing did not give me a new family, it gave me clarity, clarity that belonging should not require silence, that love should not demand invisibility, that connection should not feel like survival. I stopped measuring my worth by who stayed, and started measuring it by how I felt when I stayed with myself. That shift changed everything. I noticed how calm my nervous system became when I no longer chased acceptance, how steady my emotions felt when I honored my boundaries, how grounded my life became when I stopped seeking permission to exist fully. I learned that grief does not mean you want things to go back to how they were. Sometimes grief simply means you are finally acknowledging what you never received, and that grief deserves compassion. I allowed myself to mourn the version of family I wished I had, not to blame anyone, not to reopen wounds, but to release the hope that had kept me stuck. Letting go of that hope was painful, but it was also freeing, because hope tied to people who cannot meet you is not hope. It is self-abandonment. I chose differently. I chose to invest in relationships that felt mutual, where effort flowed naturally, where presence did not need to be negotiated. I learned to trust consistency over intensity, actions over words, energy over promises. I stopped romanticizing potential and started honoring reality. There was peace in that honesty. I also learned how to be alone without feeling lonely, how to sit with myself without judgment, how to listen to my needs without minimizing them. I became someone I could rely on. That may sound simple, but for someone who had spent their life waiting to be chosen, it was revolutionary. I no longer felt defined by absence. I felt defined by presence, my own. I stopped telling my story as one of rejection and started telling it as one of awakening, because that night did not end me, it began me. It forced me to ask questions I had been avoiding. About love, about belonging, about self, worth, and those questions led me back to myself. I realized something else along the way. People do not always leave because you are too much. Sometimes they leave because they cannot meet you where you are growing. And growth can be threatening to those who rely on sameness. That understanding softened the pain. It removed the personalization. Their inability to show up was not a reflection of my value. It was a reflection of their capacity. I stopped trying to translate myself into something more acceptable, more convenient, more digestible. I allowed myself to be whole, messy, honest, complex. I learned that self-respect often looks like walking away quietly. Not to punish, not to prove a point, but to protect your peace, and peace became my priority. I no longer felt the need to explain my distance, or justify my boundaries, or convince anyone of my worth. I trusted myself. That trust became the foundation of everything that followed. New connections felt different, safer, more balanced. I did not cling. I did not overgive. I did not lose myself trying to be chosen. I showed up as I was and let others meet me there. Some stayed, some did not, and for the first time, either outcome felt okay because I knew how to stay. I learned that healing does not erase your past. It integrates it. That Christmas dinner will always be part of my story, but it no longer controls the narrative. It taught me the cost of ignoring myself and the power of choosing myself. I no longer see it as the night I was left. I see it as the night I stopped betraying myself. That distinction matters. I am not angry anymore, not bitter, not resentful. I am grateful, not for the pain, but for the clarity it brought. I am grateful that I learned early enough that love should not feel like waiting, that belonging should not require shrinking, that family is not defined by blood alone but by behavior. I built a life that feels aligned, not perfect, but authentic, a life where I am present, engaged, whole. I learned how to celebrate quietly, to grieve honestly, to live intentionally, and most importantly, I learned that being left does not mean you were not enough. Sometimes it means you were ready for more. More truth, more depth, more self-respect. I no longer carry the weight of that night. I carry the wisdom it gave me. I know now that healing is not about going back. It is about moving forward without losing yourself. I am not defined by who failed to see me. I am defined by how I learned to see myself, and that is the ending I choose to live with, not one of abandonment, but one of becoming, because I was never truly left behind. I was set free.